He's an aristocrat. He sees that the monarchy is finished, that democracy is the way to go, but he's very frightened of ordinary people. So what's going to happen when you have democracy? And he fears that there'll be an uneducated class and uneducated people making major decisions. I think I would have said to him at the time, well, you don't understand, Tocqueville, we will have education and people will be really well educated in the future, and so they'll be very well equipped to make the decisions that you're frightened of them making. And indeed, we made a lot of noises, everybody about but of course the education system in this country is crap, and he was right. There's a lot of idiots making a lot of idiotic decisions that are frightening to behold.
This book is very interesting, that Tocqueville makes a sort of comparison between the democracy that the French Revolution is building when he comes to America, and then the democracy that he finds here. Do you see these differences today?
I don't know whether I'm equipped to talk about it. I mean, I would think that when one thinks about the different sorts of democracy, I think you would probably find that France, as it was before and during the revolution, was a highly centralized society. And I think Tocqueville was terrified of centralism and angry about centralism, and was perhaps rather romantic about a sort of a notion where a noble could play a part with his people in town meetings and something like that. Where the United States, of course, is wildly decentralized, and its powers are spread everywhere. So it makes, I guess, essentially a different sort of democracy. So I really don't. I mean, also I think Americans have been so terrified of the notion of tyranny that they've sort of somehow managed to create it.
Democracy is one thing, has special characteristic that you can import to other countries, for example, to Arabic countries,
Well, I'm very confused by it, particularly because America seems to have the sort of notion that it can export and impose what it calls democracy on other countries in the world, which generally seems to, in the end, sort of to be, there's some sort of equation with the American notions of trade, which they call free trade, which is interesting. I mean, my definition of free trade would be, say, a bull charging a chicken coop, shouting, "It's every man for himself." So whenever I hear in this country hear about democracy and Americans making democracy and freedom possible in other parts of the world, it just seems sort of so hypocritical and awful that it makes me ill. So I guess they're having trouble bringing democracy to Afghanistan at the moment, I believe. There's a lot of very unreliable people on these streets. You've got to watch out. What's your pocket?
It's I have here. It's okay.
In Australia, have you met any Greeks?
Well, it would be impossible not to meet Greeks. But have I met Greeks? Yes. Greeks were an important part of, city culture and country town culture. In my little town, for instance, there'd always at different times be different Greeks with fish shops. Like in another time, you might go to the Chinese, you would go to the Greeks for a meal.
So when you came to Greece, you had an idea of the people?
Of the food, but also the lovely thing about going to Greece then was you kept on meeting these people whose children were in Australia, and sometimes the people would be quite poor, and their children would have arrived in Melbourne, and they'd be sending photographs of themselves with a television set, or the things that was unlike their village life had been. And I think people were very nice to us because we were young in our early 20s, and they'd lost their kids to Australia, and they felt like they were particularly nice to us anyway. Always capturing us to make us drink too much, not letting us go. I remember that famous Greek hospitality. You mustn't drink too much ouzo, but you must have another one of these now. So.
Τόμας Κέρναου, καθισμένος στο γραφείο του, 120 μέτρα μακριά τους, έβαλε τα χέρια στα αυτιά του. «Τι είναι αυτό?» ρώτησε η γυναίκα του. Τίποτα, ξάπλωσε. «Για όνομα του Θεού, τι έκανες, Τόμας?» «Η καημένη εχμάλωτη». «Δεν είναι εχμάλωτη, είναι μαζί τους γιατί υπερασπίζουν τους Κέλλη. Είναι χειρότεροι από αυτή τη συμμορία». Όμως η γυναίκα του πήγε στην πόρτα τους έχοντας δεμένο το κόκκινο μαντίλι στο λαιμό της. «Είναι παιδί, δεν τα ακούς?» του είπε. «Σκοτώνουν και παιδιά τώρα?» Ο Τόμας Κέρναου ήρθε στο δωμάτιο και της έβγαλε έξαλλο στο μαντίλι. Κόντεψε να την πνίξει και έβαλε τα κλάματα. «Ο Θεός μαζί σου, κοπέλα μου, δεν βλέπεις ότι όλοι βοηθάνε τους Κέλλη? Εδώ γεννήθηκε, Τζέιν, έχεις καταλάβει με τι ανθρώπους έχουμε να κάνουμε?» «Είσαι δειλός», του ούρλιαξε. «Σκοτώνουν παιδιά». «Εγώ δειλός? Αχ, Θεέ μου, πια πήγα και παντρεύτηκα. Εγώ δειλός? Και ποιος έσωσε τους αστυνόμους ενώ εσύ κλαψούριζες στο κρεβάτι σου? Πήγαινε στο δωμάτιό σου». «Τι είναι αυτό?» «Κλείσε τις κουρτίνες. Είναι κινέζικη ρουκέτα. Είναι μήνυμα από τους Κέλλη. Να προσεύχεσαι να φτάσει η αστυνομία, να τους νικήσει». Ξανά ο αντίλαλος μιας δεύτερης ρουκέτας πάνω από την κοιλάδα και εκείνη τον πλησίασε και έπιασε τα χέρια του. «Αχ, Τόμ, τι πήγες και έκανες?» «Αυτό που έκανα», της είπε, «είναι ότι έγινα ήρωας». Two things I like very much in Kelly's book. The first is the language. The second one is that the destiny, the bad destiny of Kelly starts with his mother, that is a revolutionary, as Irish, very dynamic woman.
I thought the thing about the Ned Kelly story was that the relationship between the mother and the son was central to the story, and it really was primarily a story about a mother and a son, and that was not the way we told ourselves the story of Ned Kelly, which is generally thought to be, a very male, testosterone-driven story. And in fact, it's a story about a mother and a son. And a son born into a particular historical circumstances from which his actions seem to me, honourable and decent and reasonable. And so is it ironic that I'm not even sure he's a revolutionary, really.
New Yorker wrote something very interesting about Kelly. Says, his book, your book, has an 18th century robustness, a 19th century lexicon, and a modern liberality, and gives Carey the chance to mobilize the kind of hybrid idiom.
The origins of the book, like all books, have many starting points, but one of the starting points for this book was reading the letter that Ned Kelly dictated to one of the gang members, which as a result had very few commas, and the sentences ran on. Reading that at about the same time I discovered James Joyce. And so it was possible then to conflate or confuse a high literary voice with the voice of an uneducated bushranger, outlaw. So I tried to do it the first time just like Ned Kelly, and I succeeded so well that it was sort of unreadable, and I went back and started to use commas in a very rough sort of a way. And indeed, I spent most of my time writing that book with this rough, commaed punctuation. But when I got to the end, I thought, this isn't what I wanted to do. What I wanted to do was have this voice which was like Ned Kelly. So I was working on a computer. I did a global search. I removed all the punctuation from the manuscript and printed it out. And then I went back into it, and everything was there. I mean, everything was just sitting there because I'd been thinking of the rhythms of the sentences and their connections to each other all the time. And so it was very easy to make the decisions about where where this sentence just joins and runs into this and that runs into that, and where the breath has to end. And I thought I was committing suicide, really, because I thought no one was going to read it because I'd done this strange thing. But weirdly, it turned out I think I sold more copies of that in the United States than I'd ever sold of anything. But my first memory is of Mother breaking eggs into a bowl and crying that Jimmy Quinn, my 15-year-old uncle, were arrested by the traps. I don't know where my daddy were that day, nor my older sister Annie. I was 3-year-old. While my mother cried, I scraped the sweet yellow batter onto a spoon and ate it. The root were leaking above the camp oven, each drop hissing as it hit.
I would like to return to the person Ned Kelly. How would you compare this type of outlaw with the American type, with Billy the Kid, Jesse James?
Well, he's certainly not like Jesse James. I think Jesse James was a psychopath, probably. And I think Jesse James sort of got quite excited about killing people. And I think that Ned Kelly, if you read the accounts of Ned Kelly, he doesn't seem to have been a particularly violent man. I mean, it was a sort of a society in which, but when Ned Kelly feels wronged by somebody, by the man Wild Wright, they organise a fight with boxing gloves so it's done in a sort of, he's not known to have sort of beaten people up or hurt anybody. And the only serious, he had a fight with a policeman, which was quite justified in my opinion. I don't think he's violent. So he's not like an American sort of outlaw, and I don't think.
Yes, of course he's not, but I think that as time passes, he gets into this role he has to play. And this is interesting because it's the whole situation in Australia at that moment forced him to become an outlaw because otherwise he couldn't survive, for example. He had to.
One part of the terrible situation that those families found themselves in was that the government had its mind that they should farm wheat. And there was a Land Act. They gave them farms for nothing, but in order to keep the land, they had to keep clearing the trees and they had to plant wheat. The result of all of this, wheat did not work. There was rust that hit the wheat, and they were basically starving, struggling to keep their land by chopping down enough trees, and inevitably they stole from their richer neighbours to eat. And the neighbours basically tolerated that as a sort of a tax. So their situation is impossible anyway, and they couldn't have survived without stealing a little bit. And the police, like police in all those sorts of communities, tend towards corruption, and the judges tend to be the big property owners, so they don't have a chance in hell. And in the end, it just needs a little fight or a little something. And they're wanted and on the run. So they're outlaws.
But what about this Australian trauma, this which we can see in your books, anyway, in Ned Kelly, and this land which was built from convicts
and stolen. Like we all know. Really, we know the land was stolen from under, and that we made ourselves feel okay about it because we said, well, they weren't using it properly, they weren't farming it, therefore it was not occupied, therefore it's ours.